Stefan here again with the first of a three-part series this week I'm doing on the newest addition to my collection, the Atari 2600. The day after Thanksgiving, on infamous Black Friday, I actually got an instant Atari 2600 collection thanks to my father-in-law, who gave me two systems, a whole bunch of controllers, and about 30-something games. It was crazy. One of them even came complete in the box. That was an amazing addition to the collection, and it's something that was very fascinating for me because my first system was the NES. I completely missed the Atari, the Atari 5200, even never touched the 7200. In fact, until now, I've never actually played any console by Atari before in my life. Never knew anyone who had one, or if they had one, they got rid of it years ago before I was into gaming. So this was an interesting experience for me as someone who loves the history of the medium, who loves the history of technology in general, and who's really interested in gaming in general. This is a lot of fun. This was a great experience. So I just want to give you guys some of my initial thoughts in this video, some of my first experiences, let you know what I think of the console and what I think of why it is no longer really that collectible compared to things just like one generation later, like the NES. Why is there that big gap? Why is Atari not hold those high prices for most games and consoles like early NES games? So to begin with, why would someone like me, with obviously no nostalgia for the 2600, want to add one to my collection? And for me, I only want to add things that I at least have a couple games that I want to play on the system. I don't want to add something to my collection simply as a collectible. I actually want to play and use and learn about things, take apart consoles, play games. That's what I want. So for me, it was a lot of a fascination about where early console gaming was, as I have a particular interest in console gaming rather than the PC side. So it was a bit of a fascination, something I just wanted to have a handful of games that I would find enjoyable on the console, just to kind of have an interesting time and to learn a little bit, get a little bit more experience from gaming from that era, which is before a time that I've really ever had time to play before. And I ended up picking up MASH at a yard sale over the summer and decided now might be a good time to finally get one. And lo and behold, somehow one came to me with a whole bunch of games, more games here than I ever thought I would own for the console. I was thinking single digits, not around close to 40. So totally different. And I had expectations, I'll say, low expectations going into playing this console. I'm definitely not someone who is big on modern gaming. I'm definitely not, graphics and frame rate over story and gameplay. To me, RPGs are my favorite genre. I really like things like visual novels. I actually like some of the higher quality old FMV games. I'm all about story, I'm all about atmosphere, I'm all about art style, then music and gameplay, and the last thing I consider is graphical quality as far more modern technology. Art for me will always trump superior tech. Hands down, my favorite art style ever is the hand-drawn backgrounds with sprites, and that's what I really like. But going into this, for some reason, I always had a bit of a, there was this trepidation involved with Atari, anything pre-NES. For some reason, I thought, in my mind, it was going to be too simplistic. I wasn't going to find it fun. Going into it, it was just, I had this preconceived notion of what it would be. And that turned out to be only partially true. And it leads me into the idea of why I think Atari is not still collectible. When you think of things like the NES, you think about some games still hold pretty high prices. There are some collectible games. The NES collecting in general has actually gone up in value, whereas most Atari games, with a handful of exceptions, even complete in the box, are less than $10, some of them less than $5. Loose cards you find for a buck or two. It's not collectible. And I think the reason why is the same reason why I had that idea in my mind that it was going to be too simplistic and not fun. I think there becomes a limit where hardware limitations ignite creativity, and you can appreciate the art and can appreciate the time and the style of the game within the time frame, but I don't think that starts really until the NES. I think before the NES, things are visually a little too simplistic. There are too many limitations on the ability to create memorable, recognizable characters and a coherent story. When you look at something like even just the original Super Mario Bros. On the NES, as soon as you put that in, if you're someone who, say, didn't grow up until the 90s, or you weren't even born until the late 90s, early 2000s, that generation can still go back to the NES, something that's 10, almost 20 years older than a lot of those kids. They can go back and they can appreciate the NES and the style, because while the NES is incredibly primitive compared to what they're used to, it's just gotten to the point with that console where you can actually have recognizable art styles. You can tell that Akira Toriyama had an effect on the Dragon Quest series. You can tell a Nintendo style game versus something on the Genesis. You can look at something like Phantasy Star. You can really start seeing art styles in that time period, starting with the NES and the Master System. That, I think, is the first generation where you can really appreciate that visually, and there's just enough power in there where you can start having bigger text-based stories. You can actually have something that's a little bit more of a recognizable world, and the sound quality is good enough to where you can now create what I would consider to be real music. That was one thing with the Atari. Aside from a handful of brief little tunes, it was not quite to the level where you can think of a lot of really recognizable, memorable tunes that are more than just a couple second loops. And that to me is the issue with why people cannot go back, I feel, unless you're a really hardcore collector or you're someone like me who just kind of wanted it as an interesting historical perspective with a handful of games. Aside from people like that, it's not a generation people can go back to if they don't have the nostalgia for it. That is, to me, is sort of like the clincher right there, is can you go back to something that you have no nostalgia for, a period of time that you didn't experience? Can you go backwards? And with the Atari, I don't feel like most people can, and really enjoy it and have fun. And there's a difference between appreciating something and having fun and wanting to collect a lot of games for it. And I think for most people, they can't do that with the Atari. And that's why you had a big rise in the price of Atari. Atari 2600 stuff specifically rose in price, became really collectible in the early to mid 90s. And that is because a lot of those people that had the Atari 2600 growing up in the 70s and early 80s were now adults, now going back and focusing on that nostalgia and recollecting those games from their childhood, and maybe even getting stuff they couldn't get back then because as a kid they didn't have the money to do it. But after that generation had completed their collections, after those people that have that nostalgia were done, there was no audience left. When the nostalgic group for the NES, pretty much my age group, is now getting to that point where most people from that age group have what they want from that era, from the NES and the Master System generation, getting a little bit into even the very beginnings of the TurboGrafx and PC Engine before things went into the 4th gen. Most people that age are done or close to finish their collections. But prices have not gone down. In fact, in many cases, they've gone up for a lot of things from that generation because, again, you don't necessarily just need the nostalgia factor. The nostalgia wave of people is done. But now you're getting new waves of people that can go back and appreciate that. Whereas the Atari, that new wave never came. After those nostalgic people were gone, the next wave of collectors, that younger crowd, is much smaller. The demand really isn't there, and the supply is. So that, to me, again, is just kind of my 2 cents on why I think that is true with the Atari and how that kind of colored my experience with the system. I still had that same mentality where there were a handful of games that exceeded my expectations that I actually genuinely enjoyed, but even those, it was only for short periods of time, 10, 15, 20 minutes tops, put in the next game. And there were a lot of games that I just found didn't draw me in because things felt too simplistic and too clunky, to the point where, for me, again, I need to be drawn in and feel that there's some style, some sort of creativity, some sort of story, some group of very definable characters, not just very generic figures of color, blocks of color. And to me, that's where the majority of the collection that I have here fit in. There were a couple of exceptions though, and that I will get into in my final video when I talk about my top 10 Atari 2600 games. So again, that just kind of wraps up my initial impressions and what I've experienced and what my thoughts are on collecting for the Atari 2600 in general. What do you guys think? Are you a little bit older and did you grow up with the 2600, and do you have that nostalgia factor? Or are you one of those very few younger people now in their 30s, 20s, even teens that has gone back, that find genuine enjoyment from it, not just an appreciation?